about your work. Please take it up.
Okay, thanks for the kind introduction, and hi everyone, thanks for having me here. So I'm Yian Yin. I'm currently a PhD student at Northwestern University, affiliated with our new Center for Science and Innovation. So basically here we are trying to take very interdisciplinary approaches from social science, computational sciences, and also like complex systems to understand the dynamics of science and, more broadly speaking, like innovation sectors. So today I'm going to talk about our recent paper on quantifying the dynamics of failure across science, startups, and security. So this paper is recently published by Nature. We are very excited about it. So the idea of this paper is that if we look at the science of science literature over the past few years, we find like very exciting advances in understanding like scientific success and scientific impact. So mostly on like citations, publications. But here, what we are trying to looking at is the opposite of success and failure. And this is a 3-year project. And as we learn more and more about failures, and we feel like failure is actually very fundamental and rather than just the opposite of success. So let me start with stories that some of you might be familiar with. This in the World War II, where the British Navy, they have designed a specific kind of armor to protect their aircraft from like enemy's bomb attack. But the problem is that this kind of armor is very heavy, so you can't just cover the whole aircraft with this kind of armor. So then the problem is that which part do you need to protect? So the researchers from the Naval Analysis Centers or the big data guys in that time, they have did extensive statistical analysis of all the past aircraft, and each red dot represents one single attack from the enemy. Then you could conclude that if you look at areas at the wings or at the middle, then they got attacked the most heavily. And it looks like you should definitely protect this part specifically to let your like aircraft return successfully from mission. But then the famous statistician Abraham Ward comes out and says, "Damn, we should do exactly the opposite, because you are only counting on aircrafts that successfully return from mission." So this is called survivorship bias. The idea behind survivorship bias is like a very simple states 101 lesson that if failure becomes invisible, then the difference between success and failure may also become invisible. So this is definitely a very extreme case where the fact and what you see by only observing successes is exactly the opposite, 180 degrees. I'm not saying that in each domain, if we only look at successes, you will get the exactly opposite conclusion. But if you think about science, what we are looking at is that successful PIs who always publish that high impact papers. If you look at entrepreneurs, you see like risk takers like Elon Musk. But are we so confident that what we observe is the real conclusion we can make by only observing these successful people rather than failed cases? So this is basically what motivated us to look into failure. So we feel the science of failure is trying to, only with the science of failure, then we can really have a like complete picture of different characteristics, different factors that could determine one's future success. Okay, so let me start with a canonical understanding of failure. So this is what we learn from a lot of textbooks. So which this picture is basically saying that failure itself is not a big deal. It's just you choose the wrong direction, you made a wrong decision, the strategy is not good enough. But once you get over from your past failure, you will soon be on the right way to success, right? But A more devastating yet practical picture may look like this. The road of success is always, a lot of failures. So just singly failed once does not necessarily guarantee your future success. You may need to fail over and over again before you get to your eventual success. Let me illustrate it in a more like intuitive way. So think about when you are making a mistake and you are trying to fix it, and looks like you are using the right way to fix it. But you may fail again, and you tried again to fix it. You may still fail. So the idea of fail over and over again until you eventually can succeed. So this is not only in this story, but if you also think about like individual careers, think about J.K. Rowling, who famously like rejected by 12 publishers for her first Harry Potter book, which turns out to be the record maker in global publishing history. And Rowling is not the only person who made that. Also think about Macy, Spielberg, Lincoln, a lot of people across very different domains. These big names were initially failures and repeated failures before eventually making the big hit. And the most infamous example might be Thomas Edison, the man who failed over 1,000 times before bringing us a light bulb. So here's also a quote from Michael Jordan, is that I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. So is this true? There are many similar quotes, but if we put it in a scientific rigor, then the problem is that, as we can observe, success is often preceded by repeated attempts that initially fail. But what are the mechanisms governing the dynamics of failure? So the idea is that if you fail over and over again, is there any early signal we can capture that predict your eventual outcome? So if we think about repeated failures and trying to start it in a scientific way, then the first challenge we have here is empirical data sets. Actually, if you think about most data sets that are extensively studied in computational social science, or more specifically in science of science, then you find that there's like potentially a very big issue of survivorship bias. If we look at papers who were eventually published on high impact like journals or conferences, then what you are looking at is the scientific ideas that eventually got published. But what you did not observe is those who did not work out. So here, to overcome this gap, we tried very hard to collect 3 data sets that are very different in terms of their definition of success, their time resolution, their internal dynamics. So our first data set comes from National Institute of Health, which is the largest biomedical funding agency, public biomedical funding agency in the world. So we have obtained access to all research program grants, R01 grants over the past 30 years. So it includes more than 700,000 applications. So the principal investigators we have in this data set is about more than 100,000. So here the definition of success and failure is quite simple. Success is you submit a new grant application and got funded, and failure is the opposite. And we also go beyond from science. We look at another innovation domain, that is serial entrepreneur. We look at all entrepreneurship investments contributed by US venture capitals over the past 45 years. So this includes more than 200,000 funding rounds. So we also can reconstruct the career trajectory of all the 300,000 executives and business founders. So here we follow the canonical entrepreneurship literature, which defines success as ventures that achieve the IPO or high-value merger and acquisitions, and define failure as failing to accomplish this within a specific field. And we even go beyond the innovation domain. We look at terrorist attacks. So here we look at over 100,000 terrorist attacks by 3,000 terrorist organizations over 45 years around the world. So here success is defined as photo attacks that killed at least one person. Obviously not success for us. So here I want to clarify that three data sets differ very much, and the people may argue concerning the exact definition about success, but this is kind of what we can, the best we can do here. And as we will show in the following slides, that here we are trying to do is to build a general model that should not be highly dependent on the specific details that we define success and failure. Okay, so how do we think about repeated failures? There are two basic hypotheses that we can think about. One is the chance model. The chance model is basically saying that every attempt you do is like flipping a coin. So each attempt has a certain probability to succeed. So what this model predicts is that the number of failure until success should decrease exponentially or in a discrete way, as a geometric distribution. And the second prediction is made is that your performance before your eventual success is constant across different failures. So what this is saying is that your eventual success is due to your good luck. So you do not improve your real performance as you fail over and over again. So this is consistent with the human dynamics literature. And another way to think about it is that people do not, randomly fail. They learn something from their past failures. Failure can teach you some valuable lessons that are otherwise very difficult to learn. So if this is true, then we should expect a performance improvement before success. Even before you eventually succeed, you are already gaining more knowledge and insights about the system, so you already have performance improvement. And also, if this is true, then it means you do not need so many number of failures for you to succeed. Your number of failure until success should decrease super exponentially following a light year. So this is consistent with the learning literature about learning from failures. So which one is true? We test our two mechanisms using our three data sets. The first observation we have here is that from NIH grants to startups to terrorist attacks, people do improve their performance between the first and the penultimate attempt. So what this is saying that you do learn something from your past failure, which rejects the chance model. But more interesting, if we look at how many number of failures do you need to experience before your eventual success, then you find that it is actually decaying slower than exponential following a fatal distribution, which cannot explained by both of our models. So neither chance nor learning alone can explain the empirical patterns underlying repeated failures. So this also suggests that we need a more complex dynamics model to quantify what's really happening as you fail over and over again. So here we propose a simple model, which we call the K model, to quantify the dynamics underlying repeated failures. So the idea is that as you do one attempt, then the task can be decomposed into different components. So here for simplicity, we consider each component as identical and independently distributed. So if you think about like submitting a grant proposal, then you need to have your biosketch, you need to have your literature, you need to have experiment design, theory, justification. These are the different components of a grant proposal. Also for all kind of complex tasks, you can basically approximate the whole task as a combination of different components. So for each component, now you want to do another attempt. You review your past K failures. This is called your experience. So here K is a parameter we really care about. It characterizes your memory length of your past failures. and you are going to select your best version among your recent K failures. And you can either create a new version which generates a new version with score randomly distributed between 0 and 1 and takes you unit time. Or you think this version is already good enough, I don't want to waste time on this component anymore, so you reuse this old version for the component, which returns the original score and does not cost any additional time. So as you can see, this is a very simple model. We are trying to approximate the exploration versus exploitation process as innovators try to do since we try to do attempts one more. And one critical part in this modeling is that we want to determine the probability of creating new versions versus reusing old versions. So here we assume the probability of creating new versions as a negative relationship with the score. So the idea is that if I already have a very good past version, then my potential to improve is close to 0, then I should not create a new version, because even if I spend one more unit time to create a new version, then that's not gonna improve. But on the other side, if we have a very bad score, if Kstar here is close to 0, then my potential to improve is almost 100%. Then I should definitely create a new version. So the idea is to parameterize a family of curves going through 0, 0, and 1, 1. So here we use the power law assumption P equals to 1 minus Kstar to the power of alpha. So here alpha is an individual level parameter like characterized given a specific score. What's your preference or what's your incentive to create a new version? So it is another interesting parameter, but we are not going to play with alpha a lot in this model. Here, our primary interest is to look at the K parameter. So here we have a stochastic model. Every time you try again, you select the maximum of your past K versions, and then depending on some stochastic random choices, you either create a new version which is random between 0 and 1, or you just select your past best version. So if we want to solve this model, we can first look at two extremes. One is K equals to 0 model, which means you essentially learn nothing from your past failure. So this is like independent trying. Every time you are again flipping a coin, learn nothing from your past failure. So what this model predicts is that first, every time you try again, you need to spend one more unit time to do the next attempt. And another prediction it is making that your score is always something uniformly between 0 and 1. So your average score is always 1/2. So basically you are not learning from any of your past failures. Another prediction extreme we can think about is K equal to infinite model. So this has been closely studied in a lot of learning literature. So the idea is that if you learn a lot from your past experience, so then your performance is improving. Also, you don't need always a constant time investments to do your next attempt, because you already have very good past versions. You just need to like create a little bit to substitute your bad components, and for the most part, you can just reuse them. So then the inter-event time for you to try again scales as a power law of n, the number of your past attempts. So this is a power law relationship. As you can see, it is straight line on the log-log plot. Also, if you look at the potential to improve, which is basically 1 minus your performance, then it also scales as a power law of n. So which is basically saying that both your performance and the efficiency is improving systematically as you fail over and over again. So here we have two extremes. Learning from nothing and learning from everything. But the more interesting part might be the middle round. If we think about it practically, people may have a certain level of memory of their past failure, but it's hardly to be exactly all past failures you remember. So here we explore the middle ground, tuning K from 0 to infinite and look at what's going to happen. So we hypothesize that as you have more failures considered, you will have more levels of learning from your past failures. But what's most surprisingly is that as we analytically solve this model, we find that this system experiences a highly discontinuous transition. There exists a specific critical threshold K star. Well, below K star, although you learn something from your past failure, you will eventually converge back to the same asymptotic behavior as K equals to 0. So if you look at the orange and the yellow plot on the up left plot, you see that although they improve a little bit, but eventually stuck at a certain level. But once you go beyond this critical threshold K star, then we do see very systematic power law scaling again on the log plot. So what this is saying is that once you go beyond this threshold, you have systematic improvement both in your efficiency and your quality. And more interesting is that if you look at, sorry, one more repeated failure, K star plus 1, then you definitely have the forest, you definitely have exactly the same behavior as K equals to infinite. So this means that we already know that learning from more past failures doesn't hurt you, but here what the model is essentially saying is that learning from more past failures doesn't help you as well across a certain level. And
Yeah, and can I ask a question here?
yeah, sure.
Can you explain again what gamma is and how you determine K star?
Okay. So gamma is the exponent of temporal scaling. So idea is that we already know that under certain levels, then you will have a power law scaling, your Tn versus your n, that you are saving more and more time. Then we can extract the slope in this log plot. So idea is that if gamma equals to 0, that means you will eventually spending almost constant time as you try over and over again. But when gamma is positive, that means you will have a polar scaling. You are always saving time. You have a systematic path towards higher efficiency as well as quality. So the K star is the critical number of failures you need to look back upon as we solve this model. And actually in this modeling, K star equals to 1 over alpha, where alpha is, as I explained, the preference, the incentive for you to try a new version given a certain level of score. But here, I don't think the exact number of K star is a primary focus of our study. What we are essentially saying that no matter what kind of preference you have, you always have some threshold, have some tipping point of K star beyond which you are progressing systematically, and below which you are stuck in the stagnation phase. Yeah. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, so just trying to repeat what you said to see that if I understood it. So you're saying that regardless of the data sets that you looked at, there's always this threshold below which the chances of success is very low, and above which some sort of phase transition happens, and all of a sudden you start making a lot of progress in whatever you're doing.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
So here the phase transition can be actually mathematically mapped into some canonical example systems which are heavily studied by physicists, and we find this is more likely to be a first order phase transition. So one famous example of first order phase transition is the ice and water. If you think about the critical temperature, then if you increase a little bit, then the ice becomes water. If you decrease a little bit, then water becomes ice. So the idea of even small variations at this level can lead to very fundamental structural changes in structures and dynamics. So here what we are saying is that if you think about how many past failures you look back upon, then around Kstar, it is also true that a small variation can lead to fundamentally different dynamical behaviors. So here we are trying, so given that we have this model here, we are trying to test our model predictions. So the first model prediction we can make is that not all failure lead to success. If you think about all the stories like Thomas Edison and J.K. Rowling, what they are essentially saying is that if you try over and over again, then you will eventually succeed. But what our model is saying that if there are people who have a K larger than the tipping point K star, then there should also be some unlucky people who have their K just a little bit below the critical threshold K star. And those people, they also try very hard, but they did not succeed because they are on the other side of the threshold. They are in the stagnation regime. So here we test people who failed repeatedly and just did not success. We find that there is actually a very large population who also failed repeatedly and just give it up without a single success. And this is not simply because of that they are lazy, because if you look at how many different failures they have ever tried, then it follows a very similar distribution of that of successful people. So idea is that basically they try the same number of failures, but some people succeeded, some people failed. So the eventual success following repeated failures is not guaranteed, and choosing a strategic K here might be helpful for people from unsuccessful group to get into the successful group. And our second prediction, which is most personally think is most surprising.
Can I interrupt again? Do you mind going back to the previous plot?
Yeah.
So the horizontal axis here is the number of failures.
Yeah.
Can you remind me how that relates to K?
So here the number of failures is not directly related to K. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, as you can see the inside, there's a big population of people who eventually succeeded and also a big population of people who did not. So some might think that people who did not eventually get a success, maybe just they are lazy, they just try once and they just give up. So we tested this hypothesis in the distribution of number of failures. We find it is not the case. What we find is empirically, people who eventually did not succeed tried as many as people who eventually succeeded. So this means that the difference between successful people and unsuccessful people is not that trivial.
I see. So essentially, I could be a person that keeps trying, so N is increasing, but my K, which is sort of the learning parameter, if you like,
is a little bit low. So
right,
although you tried a lot of times, you just feel it's very hard to succeed. That would be possible. Yeah, that's what we are essentially saying.
But it can also happen, like given the phase transition, it can also happen that I might change something very small, but it happens to kick me above the threshold, which means that all of a sudden I start becoming...
Exactly. This is what we are trying to say here.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, sorry, go on.
Yeah. So let's get to our second prediction is that, as we see from our simulation, what we are saying that if we have K in the progression region, a big K, then the inter-event time for you to do it again should follow a power law scaling with respect to how many times you have tried. So you are getting fast, you are failing faster and faster. While for people who were eventually unsuccessful, we hypothesize that those are people who were in the stagnation regime. So they have almost a constant rate of trying again. So we really test this, we directly test this prediction in our data, and we do find very consistent behaviors, saying that the two groups follow fundamentally different temporal patterns that are distinguishable at a very early stage. So what this is also saying that if I take the inter-event time of your past failures to make a simple logistic regression model here to predict your eventual success, then we can still achieve non-trivial predictive power. So here, what I want to highlight is that we know this is a very simple feature, and this is a very simple classifier. The primary goal of the study is not to predict eventual success as accurate as possible, but we are trying to capture a new signal that is previously unknown. Because if you think about getting a grant that involves a lot of factors, it's based on it depends on your past scientific success. It depends on the novelty of the idea you are proposing in this proposal. It may also relate to sadly related to your gender or your race to some degree. But what we are doing in this prediction here is that we want to just use this time as a simple feature to predict eventual success. So what we are demonstrating here is a lower bound rather than the upper bound of predictive power. And I know a lot of people in the audience, you have experts in machine learning or data mining, this kind of stuff. And we really want like people like you can work together. We want to like explore the upper bound of the predicting eventual success. That's going to be fascinating. But the idea here is that we want to show that even a simple logistic classifier based on this new feature can yield for kind of strong predictive power. At least it's very non-trivial compared with a random guess. Yeah. So our third prediction looks at the performance improvement. So if we still think about the stagnation versus progression regimes, then what the model is saying that the two groups of people can be a priori very similar, but they could diverge in terms of their performance afterwards. So here we take the evaluation score of NIH grant applications, and if you look at people who eventually succeeded versus who not, the blue and orange bars are essentially the same as the first attempt. So this means that winners and losers can be very similar as the first stage, but their learning strategies are different. So we find that actually as early as the second attempt, their performance shows significantly difference. And also, if you compare within the group, you find that successful people have significant performance improvement as early as the second attempt. But for those who eventually did not make it, it looks like their performance is always constant across different attempts. So this is another evidence that's supporting that there's learning differences rather than simple initial condition differences between the two groups.
Ian, what is the evaluation score here?
So evaluation score is assigned by NIH reviewers to see like whether, so basically they have reviewers to assign score to different grant proposals, and the score is actually used to determine whether to fund or not fund this proposal.
I see, cool.
So our last prediction are trying to understand why it costs you more failures rather than fewer number of failures for you to succeed. If you can remember that as we test the chance and the learning model, we find the number of failures for you to succeed, it follows a factorial distribution. So here we find the key for being in a successful group is reuse. So if you reuse your past good versions, then it helps you to save your time, it helps you to improve your performance. But there's no free lunch. Another like consequence of repeatedly reusing is that it costs you more number of failures until your success. So we model this process and predicts that the number of failures before your eventual success should follow a Weber distribution. And the more interesting is the Weber distribution parameter, beta, is related to our parameter in the power law scaling of successful group, gamma, through a simple scaling formula. So the idea is that if gamma is large, this means that you are accelerating very quickly in your applications. You are saving a lot of time in your applications. Then the beta should be a little bit larger, which means that it takes you more number of failures for you to eventually succeed. So basically the trade-off between your inter-event time and your total amount of applications. So we test this hypothesis also on our 3 data sets, and we find very consistent empirical evidence. So together, across 3 very different domains, we find consistent patterns that are also consistent with our model predictions. And we have done a lot of robustness checks to see whether these findings can be simply explained by some external factors. And to the best of our knowledge, we find that these findings are very robust against a lot of variations and controls. Also, I want to clarify here, all modes are wrong, but some are useful. There are definitely some limitations here, and we will be more than happy if any of the audience are interested in this and work with us to further improve this model. So one limitation of our study is that there might be alternative explanations. For example, the non-success group people, they are just hedging against the failures. And but given that we are testing this dynamics in very different domains, we feel it is unlikely that hedging against failures can simply explain everything we have ever observed. And also the K model here is a minimal model, so they ignore a lot of factors that are important, like knowledge forgetting and transfer computation between different agents, and the factors learning from others. So this has been extensively studied from canonical learning literatures, and we really want to incorporate these factors into our model to make it richer and more with higher predictive power as we push this forward. So this is all I want to talk about today. So to conclude here, we have a simple 1-parameter model for understanding failure dynamics. So the most important prediction from our model and are partly supported by our empirical test is that we have a phase transition of repeated failures, which means that even in the absence of other characteristics, agents that are a priori very, very similar could still experience fundamentally different outcomes. And although they are very similar at the first stage, this different outcome can be predicted at the early stage by looking at the distinct failure dynamics in their efficiency and quality parts of each subsequent attempts. We have made 4 important predictions from our model. Each of the predictions is independently validated across 3 datasets. So together, this is trying to reveal some early signal for eventual victory and defeat following failures. So I want to conclude this talk with a quote from Thomas Edison, again, the guy who failed over 1,000 times, saying that the meaning of life's failure are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they give up. So it is actually this quote that motivated us to find some early signals. So the idea is that using big data, using complex system approaches, using some data mining strategies, now we have some approach, we have some early signal to tell them how close they were to success when they give up. So this paper is recently published on Nature, and we would like to thank a lot of people for making this study possible. Thanks. And I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully our audience also enjoyed it. I'm going to start by a quick question. The fact that, you talk about the phase transition and then early signs of success seems a bit unintuitive to me, in the sense that, if there is a transition, I expect that for a long time, I don't see a lot of differences between the behaviors of successful people and unsuccessful people. Can you clarify that a bit?
I think the idea is that if you think about as you try over and over again, you already have some good ideas, at least for some of the components. Then the key to success highly depends on whether you are gonna to keep this good idea. Because given that you have a good idea, then if you keep like randomly picking up new ideas, then it's actually very bad for your performance improvement. So I think it really makes things different is that your ability to keep a very good version once you have it. And the phase transition here is that you consider how many times you are gonna keep a good version given its score. And what makes it a phase transition is that if you think about this process, then it's almost equivalent to a random walk model when every step size is how many times you are gonna keep this good idea. Then what's the phase transition is saying that if the distribution is narrow, in that like you are just keeping your ideas for a small number of attempts every time, no matter whether the score is good or bad, then you are repeatedly trying random new ideas. It is very hard for you to eventually succeed. But when you have a large case, the K is larger than K star. So what this is saying that you are also doing a random work, but your step size have a very broad distribution, saying that once you have a good score, you keep it for a long time. And this is very critical to your eventual success. So I think what this is, what we are expecting on the behavioral level for the stagnation versus the progression regime.
I see. So if you want to quickly, so just one clarification question. So K here is not essentially, it is K of the last n steps that you're keeping in your new formulation. It's not necessarily the last K steps sequentially. Is that right?
The last K step is sequentially, yeah, I think so.
It is
it's
the last.
not the total number of your past failure. It's just how many failures you look back upon every time.
Right. But it could, like if I have tried 10 times, it could be step 1, 3, 7, and 9, right? It's not necessarily, 7, 8, 9.
Here, I think what we are modeling here is our last K failures. So the most recent K failures. But if you think about that in both like stagnation and progression regimes, as you can see, at least the average performance is not decreasing, right? It is kind of increasing. So this means that if you have to select K steps, then the best strategy is definitely to choose the most recent case steps. So if you choose some earlier steps, on average, it will only make you like worse rather than better. I think this is.
I see. Okay. So in that case, like, why wouldn't choosing all the previous steps be the best, strategy all the time? Because then I'm sort of ensuring that I'm always like k to the infinity limit is a large gamma, definitely above transition,
Yeah,
and so.
yes. This is a very good question. The idea is, why do we have a K? Why do people just do not use all their past experience? So I think that here there are a lot of factors that can impact your K. So one is the individual factor. If you think about like cognitive science literature, there's the magic number of 7 or other things, although it is only remotely related. I would say that in practical, it might not be true that every individual will always remember that all their past failures. Actually, if you think about that, when we are revising a paper, what we normally do is that we open our last version rather than open all our past versions to make a update, make a new revision of the paper, right? Another factor is the organization level factor is to think about, like, for example, terrorist organizations. Then it is embedded in the organization level memories. There's also some literature saying that because of the organizational level strategy and chain, you may not be able to retain all your past memory. And more importantly, what I think is that if you think about this on an environmental level, then you will have to only look at the recent failure. For example, if you think about science, then scientific knowledge itself changes rapidly. So even if you can keep all your past ideas, they may not become irrelevant. They may have been, like, investigated by other groups because you did not get the grant, but they did get grant. Also, if you think about the entrepreneurship, then it's like we always have different waves of ideas, from the internet to AI to blockchain. If you retain your past experience that happened to work like 20 years ago, it's not going to be very helpful, even for like terrorist organizations. And the way you launch a terrorist attack, once it is like heavily covered by media, then you might want to change it another way, because the government has corresponding like actions and policies. So this is basically what I would justify for the K. I think K here is a very simple parameter that encapsulate all these different dimensions. It is definitely a simplification of the complex dynamics that may be at work. But as long as we can see, at least it is useful in the sense that using this K model, we can capture some fundamental dynamics of repeated failures.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense to essentially use the most recent memory to make the decisions for the next step. So just, I guess there is a question from audience. I'm going to ask it a slightly different than what the audience asked. So say I'm an investor and I want to decide if a company is going to be successful, right? So based on your research, what should I pay attention to know if there are early indicators of success based on your research?
So this is a good question. So I think it depends on the real application scenario. So say if you want to do, if you want to choose from a large population, or if you want to diagnose for a single company or like a single investigator, I think statistically saying, if you have a lot of like candidates you want to choose from, then you can definitely just look at the like temporal dynamics, whether they are failing faster, although this is a perfect prediction, but it should be able to give you some sense and some early signals. But I think if we want to make it more accurately, I think there are some like predictions we can make that I don't have time to go over in this slide. For example, we talk about the reuse and create new versions. As you fail over and over again. So this means if we have more detailed data about what exact attempt does this person or does this company take, and look at whether it changes the whole direction or whether the company only made small modifications. If you use this metadata, this like to give you more information on cell failure dynamics, cell component changes, I think this would be even more powerful for you to diagnose whether this person or this company is on the right way to success. Actually, we have some preliminary results on the NIH scenario that we use the abstract of grant proposal and we extract the mesh terms, which are like specific terms in biomedical research, to see whether the investigators changed their research idea by large or only by a little bit. And we do find very consistent evidence saying that people who eventually succeeded, if you look at their research terms, they only change a little bit. But for people who eventually did not, I think just for a success group, people just like gradually change a little proportion of their research ideas. If we can have some data like for persons or companies like strategic change their each attempt, I think we should also be able to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you can go back to the slide that you were showing the dynamics from the first attempt to the second attempt, I think what I'm looking for is a more right, exactly. So a more quantitative measure, like say, if I looked at the first, or if I am a startup and I want to know if I'm on the right path, or even an investor. So if I look at my first attempt at something, what is the thing that I can measure to know if in the second attempt, am I in the blue stack or am I in the orange stack? So is this like what do you see what I'm asking?
I think if we have more data, we can definitely do that. So one simple thing you can do that is you really sit down and review all the components of in the first proposal. You look at whether the components are good and bad, and you look at the components, corresponding components in the second proposal, and see whether these people really changes the bad components and keeps the good components. I think that might be a way to diagnose and even guide the individual towards the blue group here.
I see. So essentially, what you're saying is that what we need to do is to have to essentially estimate what K is in each step that they're taking, and based on that, that could be an early indicator of success or failure.
Yeah, I think the estimate K here is very important. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And you can only do that if you have access to the concept that they're working on in all of the steps.
There are many ways of estimating K. So say that you only have the inter-event time. You can still estimate K, but it's a rough estimation, right? If you have more data, you can definitely do a better estimation of K. So it depends on what kind of information is available.
Cool. That's very awesome. So I think that's it. I don't see any other questions from the audience. So I think we can wrap up the live stream and chat a little bit after that.
Okay, cool.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.